Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Furstenberg,
And I'm Mark Tucker. We are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Welcome, everyone. How's it
Yeah,
going,
how you
Mark?
doing?
I'm
doing
doing
fine. We're talking. We got to start over. We're talking over each other.
No, let's keep it going. Keep it going.
All right, that's fine. Hey, I've got a joke for you.
Okay.
All right, so this is a joke about two brothers.
Two
All right.
brothers.
Yeah. So Pete and his brother Repeat were sitting in a boat. Pete fell out. Who was left?
Repeat.
Hey, Pete and Repeat were sitting in a boat. So this is an old joke.
You sound like you're acting like a very, very poorly designed voice agent there.
Hey, that would be an awesome idea for a Skiller action. Just do the Pete Repeat joke. Maybe it's already been done.
Over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I thought we could talk a little bit about repeat. Actually, how do you code a repeat into your Skiller action? We've had questions about that before, right?
Yeah, and we've kind of danced around the topic a little bit. I know that one of the things, and it's an important question, because one of the things that the review teams do look for is making sure that you've implemented repeat, even though they don't really give you guidance about how to do so or what it should look like. And recently we talked a couple of episodes ago about how that's a new standard intent on the action builder side. At least it is in English.
Yeah, and the same with on the Alexa side. You need to have a repeat intent, and there's a specific type, Amazon.repeat intent, and you have to implement it, but you have to implement it all on your own.
Yeah, they don't really give a lot of guidance there. So I know this is also something I tackled early on with multivocal. How do you deal with that?
Well, there's the way that you would do it in the standard Ask SDK, and there's the way that you do it in Jovo. And not surprisingly, Jovo is easier. But I guess before we jump into that, let's talk about the two different types of responses. There's the response that you give where you just say some message and you end the session and it's over. It could be something where you deep link in, but you really want to do just a, what's your horoscope for today, and it gives you the horoscope and it's done. Or when you end and you've got some sort of a message you want to give before the session ends. Mm-hmm. In Alexa terminology, that is a tell. So you do a tell and you have some message, output speech that you give, and then the session ends and you're done.
Okay.
No reason to do a repeat on that.
No. Well, there's also no opportunity to.
Yeah.
Because it closes.
You're not around. So the second type is what we call on Alexa side an ask. So that's where we give some sort of response, and then we keep the session open. And the guidelines indicate that when you do that, then you have to answer, you have to ask a question as part of your TTS response to keep the conversation going. Don't always agree with that. I think there's some cases where it's better conversationally that you don't do that, but that is a requirement. And so
that's interesting. So the guidelines on the Google side around that don't say that you have to ask a question, but they do say that you need to make it clear that you expect a response. And we get one of the common questions that we get a lot is, the review team has told me that I kept my microphone open. How do I close the microphone? And the answer is, that's not the question. They say you kept the microphone open because they didn't know that they were supposed to say something in reply. There was no prompting. So that really is just shortcut for you need to prompt the user, which usually means you need to ask the user a question.
Right. And so because that happens, maybe there's a situation on the user side of things that you didn't hear the whole text, or you wanted to, somebody came in and started talking right in the middle of you trying to listen to what was going on, and you want to be able to repeat the last thing that they said. Or sometimes you want to buy yourself some time on a quiz game trying to
think of the answer.
Just to stammer and try to think of the answer. So if you think about the output that's coming back from them, there's actually still on the Amazon side of things, there are two pieces. There's the output text that comes back, which is the message, and then the prompt, or the thing that would indicate that this is, asking a question. And then there's something called the reprompt. So on the Alexa side of things, you give the message, which is the message plus prompt. And then if they don't answer within 7 seconds, then the reprompt triggers. And that could be, in essence, as simple as asking the prompt again, just the prompt part, or giving some more detail or some detailed hint, like say this, something that will maybe help clarify why they're stuck and not answering.
Now, here's the thing. So for either of those, if they say, what did you say? Or can you repeat that? What does it do? Well, it should handle it the same way under either the prompt or the reprompt case, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's interesting. One of the, it's slightly different on the Google side. There is no automatic reprompt. Instead, that kind of scenario triggers a no input intent, and you're expected to handle the no input however you see fit. You could handle that the same way as you handle a repeat, or you can handle it the same way you handle a no match, or you could handle it in some other way. That's up to you. So either way, we've got these scenarios where the user may in some cases be confused and may ask for a repeat of some sort, right?
Right.
One of I think the design questions is, well, what does that mean? Because on the surface, and the easiest approach would be, well, you just say back exactly what you just said, right?
Right.
But that's not always the right thing. And this is where a good conversation designer might, help you out.
Yes.
So this is where a conversation designer might say, well, it might be okay to just, say back what you just said. Or maybe this is a case where the user saying repeat or asking us to say it over again really means you just used terms that were nonsensical to me. Try that again. What do you mean by that?
Say that a different way, please.
Right, say it a different way. Say it clearer. Maybe say it slower. Maybe say it, without the background noise. There's a lot of possibilities what it could mean. Regardless, though, we need to give something back.
Right. And then also let's throw into the mix the situation where you have some really long text. You're reading off something really long, and then you've got a prompt at the end. And maybe they've missed, I don't know, it's hard to tell because maybe they missed something in the middle of the long text that they want to repeat. So maybe the right answer is to repeat the whole thing. Or maybe it's repeat a gist or summary of what it was.
Right.
Or maybe it's just repeat the prompt again.
Right.
So that they know what to do. Maybe they got lost. And that's also why the guidance is to add the question at the end.
Yes.
And do the most important stuff at the beginning.
Yep.
And try to keep it short.
Right. And all of these cases are cases where a good conversation designer will help you shape that. Right.
So, all right. So we talked about kind of why we might need a repeat. But how are we going to store this information? Because it needs to be someplace, because the code on the back end is stateless. And so that on the Alexa side talks about two different places that you can store data. You can store data at the session level. So when you start up the skill, then that starts a new session. And for every response that comes back, you can store something in a session, in session variables. You can have multiple session variables. It can be a JSON object or whatnot. But that actually comes back as part of the response that Alexa's returning to the Alexa service and then onto the device. Well, I'm assuming it's onto the device, because otherwise then the Alexa service would have to keep state on its side, which I don't know that would be a good idea. But then when you ask the next, when the user gives the next response, part of the request is going to be the session information that was passed as part of the response. And so it round trips kind of like a cookie information so that you could have that information back inside your skill. So you could store, exactly what the output text and reprompt was on the response and get it back on the next request. And if that next thing that they said was repeat, then you've got, hey, this is exactly what I just stored, and it will play it back. Now, do you still keep that around, or do you make the repeat be
Repeat
the
the re,
thing that
what,
you,
what,
so
hap-
if, yeah,
if they repeat twice, what do you do? And how do you,
yeah,
you
how do
know,
you handle that? So that's the session side of things. And then, or you can store it on user with the user data, which usually means that it's stored in a database and it's persisted across time.
Mhm.
And there might be reasons to do that. If you come back into a session, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense on the repeat side of things. You're not going to jump into a session and then immediately say repeat.
No, you
Because,
might. I mean, there are
yeah,
cases where you might though. So again,
so
think,
yeah, so there's,
talk to the conversation designer.
yes, definitely some things to think about there. So tell me a little bit about it on
So,
the Google side of
so
things.
that's with the ASK, right?
Well, yeah, that is what, well, actually it's both with the Alexa Skills Kit SDK and Jovo, because behind the scenes, they store it the same way when you're on Alexa.
Okay. So on the Google side, the standard Google libraries give you absolutely no support for this whatsoever. Which is one of the things that I think I recognized early when I was writing multivocal. So one of the first things I added to the multivocal library was direct support for repeat. And it does it the exact same way. In multivocal, I break it up into two parts. One part I call the response, and one part, actually I call one part the message and the other part the suffix. And again,
Okay.
that's meant to be the response and the prompt for exactly that reason. And we can go into another time about how it actually handles the two. But it stores those as part of a session variable that it checks if you say repeat the next time, and it automatically updates it for you. So this is part of the library. You do absolutely nothing. In fact, I even provide a sample intent that you can plug in that automatically enables it. So you can literally not think about it at all. There's a catch, however, because there always is. On the Google side recently with Action Builder, so this worked great under Dialogflow, where every intent sent back a response. However, in Action Builder, that doesn't work anymore. So every scene in Action Builder can call a webhook, and it can get something from a static prompt. And it can even call webhooks multiple times in some circumstances and add multiple prompts in some circumstances. And it puts them all together into what it calls the prompt queue. And when it determines it's ready to send things out, and there are rules about when it will send the queue finally, it sends you everything from the queue. The problem is if you then say repeat, you don't know what needs to be repeated. Your webhook could have been called 3 times. And you don't know when, if it was called at the first stage of a queue, if the queue had just been dumped, what the state of the queue was when you sent that reply. So there's no automatic way to know that. You can build your system so that okay, this webhook will only be called once, and I guarantee that nothing else will have been called before then. But that's a lot of additional, there's no way that I can automatically build that into a library.
Right.
That's problem one. Problem two is that you can mix webhook calls that return a prompt and static prompts that you set as part of Action Builder. It will mix them together for you, but you, in a webhook, don't know what's been added to the prompt queue and what hasn't. So there's no good way to handle repeat anymore, which is funny because now they've given us this built-in intent, repeat. So right now, the best that I do is, there are two solutions. One is multivocal right now kind of punts on the problem. All it does is store the last thing that was sent back, and repeat will still just resend that back. It can't know about, it doesn't know about anything else. So that's all it's going to do.
That's all it's going to do.
So that's one. Two is that you can build into a scene. If you say repeat, you can kind of redirect back to the start of the scene. You can re-enter the scene. which will re-trigger everything. The problem with that is that
Mm.
other state may have already changed.
Right.
And then of course, there's just the third thing where you say, okay, repeat, we handle it specially, and because our conversation designer told us to.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a good answer either, but those are kind of the options that we have right now.
That's interesting. So I guess, have you considered storing that in a database as opposed to storing it with a scene or with a?
It doesn't, I mean, it's stored as part of the state. It's stored as part of the session state. I could store it in part of the database, but I still don't know when I don't know when the prompt queue gets dumped, when the prompt queue gets sent to the user. There's no information about that.
No events, nothing to indicate
No.
that's happened.
No.
Interesting.
Again, if I design my scenes carefully and well, I as a developer will know that. And I as a developer can say, okay, I will now manually store my part of stuff until this webhook, because I know after this webhook, it's going to get sent to the user. But that's implying a lot of structural knowledge.
Yeah, it's building in some tribal knowledge into the
Right.
into the system that somebody else will jump in and like later have no idea what's going on.
Where there's a good chance that somewhere that will fail.
Yeah.
And
it's one of those multiple days trying to scratch your head and figure out why this simple thing is failing.
Right.
Yes.
So this has been a request. This has been an item that has been identified with the team since Action Builder launched last year, and we haven't gotten a solution yet.
Oh, interesting. So, no, that sounds like it's a kind of a conundrum. It's a requirement, but not really any support, and not necessarily a good way to support it. Whereas it seems like it's a lot simpler on the Alexa side of things. There isn't a way to specifically just say store state. You have to still do that on your side, which would be, the hard way, brute force way, is that every intent that returns a response, you would take and store the information in a session or in the database. The easier way with like the Alexa Skills Kit SDK is there's something called response interceptors. So you can say, I want to handle, here's some code right before things get returned on the response. And you could look at the fields for the output speech and the reprompt, take a snapshot of those, store them someplace else in a different variable. And then when you say repeat, then pull those out of that session or user. So that's how you do it on the Ask SDK. Now it's quite a bit easier on the Jovo side of things. They've chosen to go ahead and use the user data. So storing in the database, that's where your repeat's going to be. Because actually what they do is there's a setting for user context. And so in a config file, you just turn on user context, which was really just a shortcut method of saying, I want you to store the previous request and response and store that in along with the user data. So they go ahead and do that. And then when you make the call to, it's time to say repeat, then you just have to do this dot repeat. Let's see, I think it's the official call is, just this dot repeat. So because you're doing multi-platform, then you can create a repeat intent, and that's what Google will use. And then you can make a mapping from Amazon.repeat intent to repeat intent. So then there's automatically a mapping between those two. So then Alexa works, and then you just do this dot repeat, and it pulls it out of the previous response context and takes those values and puts them in. Now you can do something special in certain circumstances. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that, but it's a config setting and a function call inside of repeat, and then it's implemented.
Well, that makes sense. And it sounds like, Jovo is doing largely the same thing that Multivocal is doing on that front. It's, except, automatically saving it for you. Because it doesn't make sense not to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, and it's interesting because by default, by just turning it on, you have the ability to store, just the last request response. But you can put a value in there, say like 3 or 4. So
that's nice.
Store kind of like I think with Dialogflow, you were able to store kind of a history of contexts or an ability to.
You could set a context so that it lived for multiple turns,
Okay.
and you could update the context during those turns. So it was certainly possible to store multiple levels back. The better way to do that, though, would just be to store it in a context and update the context.
Okay.
Actually, that's similar in some ways to something that I do support in multivocal with Action Builder, is that there is, it keeps track of which scenes you are in. And when you change scenes, it keeps a stack of the last 5 or so scenes that you've been in. And there's a way to automatically say, go back 3 scenes.
Oh,
or
interesting.
go back to the previous scene. So you could have, for example, a global help intent where you just said, help. You could then look at the last scene that you were in to figure out where you are and provide context sensitive help. And then when you were done, return back to that scene.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it's a way of like saying, put a placeholder here. I'm going to go do something else, but then go right back to where you were.
Right.
Okay.
Or it gives you the ability to do that. It
Yeah.
doesn't do it for you automatically, but it gives you the ability to implement that if you need to.
Yeah, no, that's important.
So yeah, so that's, repeat's pretty, it seems like it is a crucial thing. They require us to have it, and yet there's all sorts of different ways to approach it. And we've got only we've got some tools to handle it and some tools that kind of leave it up to us.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's interesting how the different approaches, and then the problem with Jovo is then you still have to try to figure out how does this differ across all the different platforms?
Right.
Like, where do you store it? And I think that's part of the reason why they made the decision to just go ahead and store it in the database, because then that gives them control. They don't necessarily have to worry about, am I storing this in a scene? Am I storing this in a context? Am I storing this in a session?
That makes sense. And there's no downside to doing it that way, certainly. That makes sense. I think the pre-send handler on the ASK is a really clever approach to doing that, though.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think behind the scenes, that's really what's happening on the Jovo side of things.
Yeah, probably.
Is that when you, because you don't have to do any additional code in any of the intents to store the state, it just says right before, because Jovo has this concept of middlewares, which is like a pipeline at what different point, and you can do, before and after as well. So you could say, I want to, right before I save this to the database, or right before I return back a response, then it can capture some information. That's what speech markdown does too. It actually takes the speech markdown that you've put in your code, and it's totally not SSML by the time that it gets to the end, and right before the end, it converts it into SSML. And
it's actually similar to what multivocal does in this case as well. Is there's a specific step before it does. There's a final send processing before it actually converts it to the response format. And that send processing says, oh, do we need to repeat? Well, in that case, do this and save these values to use in the future, if not.
All right, well, unless I repeat myself, I think we've pretty much covered the repeat functionality from my perspective.
So do you think Pete would be okay with all of these approaches?
I think he would be once he dries off.
Okay. So if you've got another approach about how you would handle repeat, or what you would do with poor old Pete, we'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments. Otherwise, if you've got questions, we'd love to hear your feedback.
So take care, everybody. We are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Take care.
Take care, Alan. Have a good week.
You as well, Mark.